Hello there, White Sox and baseball fans. I mentioned in my last video that I had an interview coming up with a Hall of Fame voting journalist, and that is what this video will be. As a lot of you know, I have a podcast as well, another one of my fun side projects where I talk to anybody that has a really interesting story to tell. They can be authors, they can be filmmakers, even a board game designer, somebody that created a lot of really great board games like Betrayal at the House on the Hill, Risk Legacy, Pandemic. A lot of these board games, this guy created all of them, so I had him on recently. But there's also been this really interesting trend of people that I reach out to having a big connection to baseball, which there's something interesting to be said from that. I don't exactly get it so far, but like Bill James, who you all know from the world of Moneyball and all that, he's got this great book called The Man from the Train, which actually looks at unsolved murders in history. Anyway, there's been a lot of overlap with baseball in my podcast, although usually they're not directly about baseball. This one's a little different, and again, I reached out initially to Joe Posnanski. You see his name in the title, and you probably recognize visually or hearing it because he has been a very prolific baseball writer, sports writer in general, but primarily within the world of baseball for a long time. He currently works with The Athletic. I won't give his full introduction now because you'll hear it in a little bit. But I initially reached out to him because he wrote this fantastic book about Harry Houdini that I absolutely love. A very, very interesting story. A lot of Illinois and Wisconsin tie-ins to Houdini growing up and where he had important moments in his life. But also, he just released a book at the end of last year called The Baseball 100, which is his list of the top 100 baseball players of all time. Of course, that is in the news a lot right now because ESPN did their own very controversial list of the top 100 players of all time. You've probably seen a lot of other YouTubers commenting on that and starting to put together their own lists. If you guys want me to do something like that, I'm not going to do exactly that, but I could come up with some fun way to come up with the top 100 list. It is just an intense undertaking. And how do you compare somebody from the dead ball era to the juice ball era? And how do you compare people that played maybe in the Negro Leagues that really never got the shot they should have gotten? Even someone like Satchel Paige, he did play in the majors, but long after his peak years. So how do you really compare Nolan Ryan or Clayton Kershaw to Satchel Paige? It's just too difficult to do. So I'm not even going to try it. I'll leave that to everybody else to chase their tails on it. But I can still come up with an interesting list, I think, if you guys want something like that. On that note of interesting old-time baseball players, I really have to give a shout out to a YouTuber named Kazro, who is not a name that I would usually bring up on this channel because she really does strange, odd histories, that kind of stuff. But she just did a baseball video that is fantastic about Rube Waddell. She calls him the weirdest baseball player that ever lived, and he is a Hall of Famer. That's one thing she didn't mention in that video she did, but this guy was an absolute character. Highly recommend going over, checking out that video. I'll link to it at the end and in the description here. And to be honest with you, I'd like to get her on my show. I'd like to interview her. So if you do go over and check it out, if you enjoy it, go ahead and leave a comment saying, hey, Scott Marcus sent me. Maybe that would help me book her eventually. We've had some conversations, but she's not on the schedule yet. Getting back to Joe Posnanski, what you will see here, it's going to be an audio podcast, so you will, just have it play in a background window. Hope you enjoy it. I cut out all the Houdini stuff. I kept it just baseball for this video. If you do want to check out the full interview, I'll have a link to that as well. The show is called The Fantastic Story Society, and again, we interview creators of every type. But without much further ado, I will let you guys listen to the interview I did with Joe Posnanski. We talk about the Baseball 100. We talk about how hard it is to vote for the Hall of Fame. Just to give you guys context, at the point that I interviewed him, he had placed his votes already. The votes hadn't been announced, but it was kind of too late for me to change any minds or anything like that. He, by the way, was inducted into the Polish Sports Hall of Fame in the same class as A.J. Przinsky recently, so we bring that up a little bit. I give a shout out to Mark Burley and tell him that in the future he should be voting for Burley. I also, there's good stuff to hear also about Minnie Minoso, who is somebody that I campaigned who should have been on his top 100 list, and he actually agreed that was one of the cuts that was the hardest to make. He was probably guy number 101. He also believes that Shoeless Joe Jackson should be in there, but he doesn't have a number 19 in the top 100 in honor of the 1919 White Sox. So there's some good White Sox talk, even though he's talking about baseball overall in general. We also talk about his path to becoming a writer, because I think a lot of us might have interest in becoming a writer, working in sports journalism in some way. So we talk about how he got started as a writer in general in this portion of the interview as well. But if there's a certain topic that you want to see, just go ahead and check out the timeline down here at the bottom. I have tagged what topic we're talking about at which point. Of course, I'd love to talk to players and former players, but if there's anybody at all in the world of baseball that you would love to see me interview right here on this channel, leave requests, comments, and I'll see if I can make things happen. Obviously, if you guys have any connections that you could help me connect with somebody fun and important and exciting to talk to, let me know. But for now, enjoy my talk with Joe Posnanski.
Thank you for joining us for a beautiful day of baseball. Or magic tricks, and escapes, and seances. Well, we're kind of all over the place today, so let's just go ahead and hand it over to the best play-by-play guys in the business. Give it up for Matt Stin and Scott Marcus.
All right, a baseball version of Fantastic Story with like a dash and a half of not baseball.
Yeah.
But we're opening the doors to our society here, and we're going to be leaning into a couple things that Scott and I love. I mean, of course, we love the supernatural and paranormal stuff, even though we don't go into that a lot in this interview. We are going to talk about it a little bit before we dive into our guest's interview. But baseball, I mean, middle of January, it's freezing in Wisconsin.
There's a lockout going on. There's so many reasons to not be talking about baseball right now.
Yeah. Which really just gives us, the two of us, that much more of a reason to talk about baseball.
Yeah. And if you're not a baseball listener, or baseball fan, if you're listening and not a baseball fan, we do talk a lot about, well, I mean, I think in general, it's always fun to listen to somebody's approach to writing, regardless of what the topic is, because there's some shared traits that all writers have, even if their topics are super different. To understand the philosophy is fascinating. But then also our guest, Joe Posnanski, is such an accomplished writer on so many different fronts. And he is most known as a sports writer. He's written books on a lot of different sports, not just baseball. But he also wrote one of my favorite books that I've read over the past couple of years, which is a great book about Harry Houdini. So definitely a variety of topics that Joe likes to cover.
He's a little bit of a Renaissance man, if you really even want to go that far, but it's just because of the number of topics that he writes about, and it goes to show just how curious he constantly stays. Yeah. And I think that was the most interesting part about the interview. He's consistently looking for great stories, whether it's in the sports world or not. So I think it's good that you brought up the fact that for any of our listeners who aren't sports fans, it's still fun to just hear how he goes through the process of writing his book of the 100 greatest players in baseball. Because I asked him a question, were there any stories? Because he's not just giving reasons why he thinks it's the greatest player. He's telling very personal stories about that particular player. And so it's not just stats and things, it's actually going into the backstory. And I asked him, were there any stories that you just thought, oh God, I need to get through it? And his answer was great. It was not expected, but it wasn't a direct answer of, there were 4 or 5 of them that I hated. Like, it wasn't that at all, because it speaks to just how curious and excited he is about the material when he's writing about it.
Absolutely. And I couldn't help but think after the fact that, okay, this episode is kind of split in half. Half of it is the 100 greatest baseball players of all time, and the other half is just Harry Houdini. And I think Harry Houdini would think, yeah, that ratio sounds about right.
Yeah, it's a fun interview. Here's Joe Posnanski. Enjoy, everybody.
Today, we are joined by our second straight Substack writer. After the amazing David Ferrier closed out 2021 for us, Joe Posnanski is a baseball man through and through. Current writer for The Athletic, but he has written for a number of other regional and national publications, including Sports Illustrated, NBC Sports, MLB.com, and many, many more. His blog, joeposnanski.com, has been nominated for a National Magazine Award. I mean, really, he's won so many different prestigious awards and even had one named after him. He's got a podcast, too, called The Poscast, which he co-hosts with Michael Schur of The Office, Parks and Rec, and The Good Place fame. Oh, and the king of all media himself is an accomplished book writer as well, profiling a number of fascinating names, not just throughout sports, but throughout history. We'll be talking a lot today about Harry Houdini and his latest book, The Baseball 100, which was released towards the end of 2021. Joe, it is our honor to welcome a storyteller like yourself into the Fantastic Story Society.
It's an honor to be in the Fantastic Story Society.
I just love that intro, man. It's so ridiculous, but this is what we do. It's a little fantastic. Thank you for doing this, Joe. What prompted this, this career for you?
Well, that is a question. So I was one of those kids who had no earthly idea what to do with my life. I'm always kind of jealous of people that like at age 8 they wrote their first story, or they would like deliver their own homemade newspaper to the neighborhood when they were 11 or whatever. And like all the businesses I've been in are filled with these people that just sort of knew what they wanted to do, and I had no idea, and that is not even the slightest exaggeration. I certainly never saw myself as a writer of any note. I never had anybody tell me that I was a good writer. I did not excel in any of my classes to the point that anybody would have thought of me as a writer. So it was a complete fluke for me in a lot of ways. When I went to college, I went to become an accountant. I actually began as an accounting major at the school. And I always tell this story, and it's really true, but I tell it like when I speak at places. I actually stayed at home when I was in college. I commuted to school, and I used to take the city bus back from school, back and forth. I would go every day on the city bus, and I was looking out the window and I saw this business park, and there were all of these people outside. It was a beautiful day. They were all, just sitting around. They were smoking and talking, and they all had these business suits of various kinds, and carrying satchels and briefcases. And I just remember vividly this feeling. It was like an out of body feeling that was never going to be me. That was never going to be me there on that lawn. And coincidentally, that was the day I had failed out of accounting. So it worked out really nicely to have that sort of epiphany at exactly the moment when my life was collapsing around me. And
what kind of emotion was associated with that feeling that I'm never going to belong to that tribe?
It was an emotion of complete failure. I just felt like it was one of those things that, and it's funny looking back on it, because now my daughter is about the age that I was when I had that feeling. And so I see her, going through not the things that I went through, but those same, being at that same stage. And I was sort of waltzing through life. I just kind of thought like, oh, I'll just go to school and I'll become an accountant and that'll be it. And it was sort of like there was no emotion attached to it. It was sort of like, when you get an IKEA set at the beginning and you work your way through all of the baffling instructions. And at the end, you have a piece of furniture. That's kind of how I saw my life. Like, okay, I'm going to get this IKEA set, and then at the end, I'll be an accountant. I tell it as a joke, but I was really lost. And I went home, and I had a typewriter that my mother had given me a few years earlier, an electric typewriter with the self-correcting. It was really advanced for the time. And I wrote a bunch of letters to a bunch of people. It was really the first thing that I'd ever done sort of to take control of my life. And I just wrote letters to people in journalism, people in broadcasting, people in entertainment, like just a bunch of letters to people who I could find their addresses, basically just saying, I'm a lost soul. I have no idea. How did you get your job? How did this work for you? And one of the letters I wrote was to Bob Costas, the legendary broadcaster. And it is like, we are now very good friends. And it's very funny that,
that's amazing.
Sort of there at the beginning. Yeah. I have a whole Bob Costas story, which is way too long to go into.
But what prompted you to write letters to those particular people as opposed to the person who owns McDonald's or,
Right. I saw McDonald's without in any way a joke as my fallback position. I really did.
Okay.
I really did. I liked sports and I liked entertainment. I liked movies. Was always a big movie guy. I didn't really know, anything like what I could do. I guess I thought, well, people write, so I guess I could write. And so that was how I chose. I just thought people who had really cool jobs. Like I thought, oh, Bob Costas, that's a cool job. Like I'd like to be on TV and talk about sports. That seems fun. Or the main point being, one of the people I wrote to was the sports editor of our local newspaper. I was in Charlotte then. I'm actually back in Charlotte, North Carolina now. But I wrote to the sports editor of the Charlotte Observer, basically the same, letter that I wrote to everybody. I mean, they were all different, but, said, hey, look, I don't know what I'm doing, but, you guys seem to have fun. So like, is that a job? Like, could I, and he wrote back, and a few people did, but he wrote back and said, we actually offer an opportunity for people like you. If you want, we'll pay you $20 you can go out to a high school game and write a game story, and you might like it. That might be something you have a knack for or whatever. And I mean, I was ecstatic. I mean, not only because it was a potential job, but I mean, I needed the money. I mean, like I was basically, I was living at home and didn't want that to last forever. So I went, and I just, once I did it the first time, it was so exciting to me, and it felt so right, that I was hooked. I mean, I was hooked, and obviously, if somebody had called me and said, "Hey, we need a gopher around here in the writer's room at some place or something," then I would have been hooked there. That just sort of was the way that it led for me. And once that started, I really became a different person. I just became very ambitious and driven, and all of those things were completely not true for me before that. I was completely, I just completely changed. I would call them at the paper literally every day to ask them if there was anything I could do, if there was any place I could go. I started reading, as much sports writing as I could to sort of figure out, what was the secret. And I started writing to other sports writers, asking for advice. And I mean, I just became utterly obsessed. And it's really interesting because I see and talk to people all the time who are that age, who are still trying to figure it out and trying to figure out what they're doing. And I tell them, and I really believe this to be true, it's like, you just need a light to turn on, and for me, it took a long time, but once that light turned on, I knew exactly what I wanted to do.
It's pretty amazing when passion meets, I can put food on the table.
Yes. Yes.
I don't mean to belittle that, but
not at all. I worked in my father. So my father, look, I grew up in we didn't have a lot. My dad worked in a factory. I worked in that factory for one summer. In the factory my dad worked, made sweaters in North Carolina in the summer. It's 112 degrees inside or whatever. And as I'm sure you guys will know, that'll motivate you to sort of find yourself right there. That was not for me like, oh, it's a summer to make enough money to buy a used car. It was okay, you know what? If I don't turn this around, this is it. This is my life. And yeah, I didn't want that to be my life. So yeah, it's a motivator for sure.
When I'm working with my writers and they're trying to either develop a concept or really just kind of develop their own craft, I have them look back in their life for, I call them pressure points that kind of change your perspective on the world, which then helps define their voice, their commentary, their, what they think, their opinions. So you had like a pressure point moment, and kind of leaning into the idea of voice is like, journalism is interesting because there's a level of just report the news.
Yes.
And give us what's happening. Obviously journalism now, I should say mainstream media, has turned into just a whole bunch of opinion pieces. And in my own opinion, I think that's what's wrong with the world. But we don't need to go into that. To go back to voice, I mean, how long did it take you to kind of see, oh, this is kind of my personal style, this is my voice? Because I found it really interesting that one of the first few set of sentences in your Houdini book is talking about Houdini's voice. And I'm like, oh, I want to talk to Joe about that.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting, even though I, certainly started as everybody did in the business when I was growing up into it as somebody who was a beat writer who wrote, high school stories and game stories. And I wouldn't call them dry features, but, features without a lot of voice, without a lot of opinion. I was pretty well driven from the start to become a columnist. And that would be one that I could, offer my opinions, but even more offer myself, right? Like really allow my voice to come through. And when I figured out what a columnist was, which, all of these, everything along the way for me was completely foreign. So I literally had no idea what any of this meant or how any of this worked. But when I realized, oh, well, here they are, here are the stars of the paper, at the Charlotte Observer, there were two columnists, Ron Green and Tom Sorensen, and they were two, legendary guys. Ron particularly had been there forever. And, I started talking to them and I thought, well, that's what I want. I want to be one of those guys. I want to be able to go to big events and write what I think about them. That would really be fun. And so that was what drove me. So I was driven by the idea of voice, but of course it takes a long time. I was lucky. I became a columnist when I was 24 years old in Augusta, Georgia, which was at the time, it didn't feel like the luckiest break in the world, but it really was the luckiest break. I mean, I was very young. And I remember actually, I was talking with somebody, the sports editor of the Washington Post, and I was telling him, what I wanted to do. And he was, seeing if I could, I wanted to see if I could work for the Washington Post. That was my big, dream. And he said, you're a columnist. If that's what you want to do, you ought to write columns. His advice was, go to Augusta, write columns, figure it out, make all the mistakes. And if that's what you want to do, that's probably going to be your best path. And it was. He was 100% right. I went down there and I made millions of mistakes. I mean, just and when you're a columnist, your picture's there above your story. So every mistake you make, they know who to call. Like there's no sort of random, I'll just call the paper and complain. It's they ask for you specifically. So, but it was really, really fun. And I mean, I learned, so much. I mean, I was trying to write columns. I wanted to write columns every day. And I there were days I wrote 7 days a week. I just wanted to get better. I wanted to learn. And frankly, I wanted to get out of Augusta. I mean, you're driven by all those things. But yeah, I mean, for me, voice came from reading the people that I really admired in not just as sports writers, but across the board, including a lot of fiction, and then writing constantly. And that's where you start to sort of, the day you realize that, hey, I might have a little voice is the day you realize you're not trying anymore. You're not just trying to throw something in. It comes out of you. It's a much more natural thing. And it takes a long time for sure. And you guys know that.
Yeah, out of curiosity, as you talk about writing, and you did so much just learning on the fly because you went to school for a math-based career and didn't go that way. And I know for anyone listening, if you want to find maybe the best deal on the planet book-wise, the best I think pages per dollar is probably the Baseball 100, which checks in just shy of 900 pages. I'm curious, what is your typical day like? You must write to some degree every day, if not a ton. And has that changed now that there's a baseball lockout going on too?
It never changes now. And really for the last, my wife could tell you, we've been married for this could be our 24th anniversary coming up. And she can tell you it's every single day when we're on vacation, whether it's the weekend, whether there's something going on, whether there's nothing going on. I always have a lot of ideas in my mind, and, being somebody who doesn't specialize sort of leaves the whole world open, I think a lot of people would know me from the baseball writing, obviously the Baseball 100, but I just am constantly thinking. The other day we watched the Lord of the Rings series. I'd never seen it, and we decided we ought to watch it just for the pop culture references, and because I've seen most of the Oscar-winning movies, so I thought, okay, well, we'll watch it. And so
Max is biting his tongue so hard he may have chopped it right off. He can recite most of the books to you.
Major Tolkien geek over here.
Yeah. So you're not going to like what I'm going to say. So, no, look, it's not for me. I didn't get it. I didn't understand it. I didn't read the books, and I'm sure that's a big part of it. To me, it was a lot of fighting and a lot of Sean Astin saying Mr. Frodo. That was basically what it was. And that's okay. But the only reason I bring it up is that we got a baseball lockout. So I'm writing a piece about watching Lord of the Rings and how it's led me to trying to figure out what the 10 happiest movies are that I've ever seen.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah. So I always am doing stuff like that. The funny thing for me has always been that some of the biggest pieces that I've ever written have not been sports pieces. I mean, probably the most widely read piece I've ever written, even with the Baseball 100 and Paterno and all these other things, is probably this piece I wrote about taking my daughter to see Hamilton. Which ended up going absurdly viral, and you know, I was getting calls from all over the world about it. I mean, it was and it was cool. I mean, it was a very meaningful piece to me. But for me, that's my mind, the way my mind works. I mean, I'm definitely a big sports guy, and 95% of what I write is sports and all of that. But it's, for me, it's the writing and it's the storytelling. And basically my mind comes up with an idea, and that idea will not leave until I write it. You know,
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
Yeah. And there's such a lesson there in that it was a piece that you wanted to write. It came from the heart. It was meaningful to you, as you just said. And that's what resonated with the world.
Yeah.
That's always the connection that connects a creator to an audience.
No question about it. No question about it. I mean, there are pieces that you write that you don't care. I mean, you care. Of course, as a writer, you always want people to see your work, but you realize you're only writing it for yourself at the end of the day. And you're putting it out there because you hope other people will connect to it. But even if they don't, like that Hamilton piece, if 0 people had read it, it wouldn't have meant any less to me. It was a piece I wanted to write. It's a piece that I look back. It's a snapshot in time. It was 5 years ago. So my daughter was in 8th grade. She's in college now. I mean, it's a very, very meaningful piece to me. But I think it is the fact that I did write it for myself that probably made it just become this massive thing.
Let's use that as a little bit of a springboard as we go to another really well-regarded non-sports piece you wrote. And of course, the reason I first reached out to you, and that is your book on the life and afterlife of Harry Houdini.
Yeah.
Did you set out to write a book, or do you think this could be an article and it grew, or how did you even approach it?
You know, it really is interesting. Every step of that one was kind of like a surprise to me. I was thinking about what my next book was going to be, and the publishing house really was pushing me to write a big biography, but they wanted it to be a sports biography. So they were really pushing me on the idea of, what about a Babe Ruth book? And that didn't interest me. There have been a lot of not that there haven't been a lot of Harry Houdini books, but I've read a lot of Babe Ruth books. To me, I felt like it was done. Like, I didn't really know what there was left to say about Babe Ruth that interested me particularly. You know, there has been, since then, my friend Jane Levy has written a very good Babe Ruth book, an excellent book. She was fascinated by a different element of him. I was not. The one thing that I thought was interesting to me about Babe Ruth is Babe Ruth comes from a time of wonder that doesn't really exist now. Like, the many, many flaws of Babe Ruth were pretty much beside the point. He was this larger than life figure in his time, and he inspired this sense of awe and wonder in people. And I thought I had maybe something to say about that, maybe something to say about a little bit of us losing a little bit of that sense of wonder and awe, but also us still very much wanting to connect to it, you know, I mean, in so many ways. And I thought, I love that concept, but Babe Ruth's not the right guy to write it about. And I immediately thought the person to write about it is Harry Houdini.
Talking about curiosity and finding people fascinating. I mean, you found 100 people in baseball that were, for this reason or that, fascinating to you because you made a list of the 100 greatest baseball players. But this is going to sound like a joke, but I'm kind of serious. Were there any guys in this list where you were like, oh, I just need to just get through his story?
Wow. It's a great question, because it is 100.
Yeah.
That's a lot of people. No, I wouldn't say exactly like that. I would say there were certainly people in there that I found it easier to write about. Like, their stories were more compelling, like instantly compelling. Like, there were, like, if I was writing about somebody who, you know, like a Carlton Fisk, right, whose father was this taciturn, you know, difficult, nothing is ever good enough for him. I love that story. That story is very easy for me to tell. And there were others that it was like, all right, I'm not sure what the hook is here, right? Like, I'm not sure, but I enjoy trying to find the hook, right? I enjoy trying to find, and there were some people that I used them, as an opportunity to write about something else. Like in for instance, when I wrote about Burt Blyleven, I ended up writing a whole lot about baseball cards, just using him in that way. So I wouldn't say that there was any essay that I found tedious. Like every essay I really, really enjoyed doing, but they're all different. So there were certainly essays that what I was writing came to me very quickly, and there were others where it was more of a dig to try to.
Well, it's a hell of an exercise. Like if you were to give this exercise to any writer and be like, write their life story in 3 pages or or less and do it for 100 people, I think quite literally anybody would be like, are you out of your mind? So,
especially people that do the same thing, right? I mean, like if you said, okay, I'm going to give you 100 random people, that'd be like, okay, well, they're all over the place, but they're all baseball players and they were all really good at baseball. So yeah, so there is a little bit more of a challenge when you do it that way.
Well, was this like a favorite story per player list, or is this your opinion on who the greatest baseball players were? Because I know Scott and I chatted about this, and the book isn't necessarily comparing stats and here's why I chose this person. It's just you're going into the stories, which I think makes it unique. But how did you come up with this? Like you must have a favorite player, and then you were like, I can't put him number 3.
Right. Well, no, my favorite player is Dwayne Kuiper, who was a second baseman for the Cleveland Indians when I was growing up, now the Cleveland Guardians, when I was growing up in Cleveland. And he was a light hitting second baseman who hit 1 home run in his entire career and was caught stealing more times than he tried to steal. And or was successful, and was not the world's greatest player, but the world's greatest guy. So I lucked out when I picked my hero. He was not going to make the list. So the list is a combination of a lot of things. It is statistically based in that I worked with a baseball statistician, Tom Tango, and we came up with a formula to try to create a list of the 100 greatest players. And that list was the starting point. It was not the finishing point because, as you guys know from reading it, there are Negro Leagues players on this list. Those players that played in the Negro Leagues before Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier. There's a player from Japan who never played in the major leagues on this list. So the list is actually pretty. It's a little bit wider in scope than just the statistics. But I did start with a list. So this is my true belief of the 100 greatest players who ever played. And it is ranked in the order that I believe they should be ranked. So it is all of those things. At the same time, it's not, right? Because at the same time, I play around with the numbers and move people around to where I want them. And as you said, and this was really important to me when I was writing it, I don't believe, other than maybe one exception, I don't believe any of the essays talk about the rankings at all. The last thing in the world I wanted to do was say, okay, Greg Maddux is number 31, and here's why. Like, yeah, right. I that was literally the last thing I wanted to do. And if I ever felt myself doing that, I would have stopped writing the book, because I so opposed to that idea. I wanted this to be stories about these people, something about them that made them special, something about them that made baseball great. And so I try to do that with each one. But the rankings are the rankings. And I have, as you might imagine, heard plenty of people yelling at me about the rankings.
I was going to say, I mean, how much backlash have you received?
Plenty.
Pete Rose as low as he is?
That has to be not just talking about Pete Rose, but in general, doing a list-based book.
Yes.
That has to be part of the design, is that it's going to get people debating.
Yeah. Well, and especially when you're like, if I put Barry Bonds number 3, which I did, there are a lot of people that are not going to like that. That's, there are a lot of people that are not. And when you put P. Rose number 60, when you put Sandy Koufax in the 70s, when you put people are going to be very, very opinionated about that. But to me, that's the fun part. And that's the way I always viewed it. I mean, I say right at the very beginning of the book, look, you're going to have disagreements, bring them on. Let's go. I mean, I think when we're arguing about whether or not Wade Boggs should be ahead of Ken Griffey, we're not arguing about all these other things that are much more important in the world, right? So I'm all for that. I'm all for the fact that this list is completely and utterly there to be picked apart. I mean, that's at the heart of it. But I hope along the way that you'll read these stories and you'll like them. The list starts off with Ichiro Suzuki, and Ichiro is number 100 in the book. So right away, there are many, 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 many people who are insulted by that.
I was immediately like, wow, really 100?
Right. Yeah, right. So everybody, and lots of people were, and they should be. That's fine. Like I say. But then hopefully you read the Ichiro essay and you realize how much heart I put into it, and you know that's more important than the ranking.
The irony for me when I was reading Ichiro's essay, I was like, he's still only 100. He's
exactly
greater now.
That's what you want. Like literally one of my favorite people in the history of baseball is Tony Gwynn, who we lost a few years ago. And I got to know Tony just a little bit. He's number 95 in this essay, which in the book, which is way lower than many, many, many people think he should be. But the essay is one of the most loving essays I wrote. So I get, the anger and it should be there. But for me, what was really important was, hey, does the essay live up to who they are? And that's sort of what I was trying to focus on. And look, I love it. I love when people yell and scream and complain about it, because that means they're passionate. If they didn't complain, this is the other thing I have thought about. If they didn't complain, what they're saying is, I don't care about your book. Right. Because it's just my list. It's not like the official list, like something you need to argue about. If you could easily just write it off and just say, whatever. But the fact that people feel strongly enough that they want to argue about it, want to convince me that Babe Ruth should have been ahead of Willie Mays or whatever the case may be, tells me that they care. And that's, I think, the best thing a writer can hear.
I totally agreed with the Willie Mays choice, just to pat you on the back.
Thank you.
Fergie Jenkins, I think could have been up there.
Oh, well, Fergie thinks that. So
Not number 3, I'm just saying.
Well,
great player.
I love that there's such a good representation of the Negro Leagues here as well.
Yeah.
Was that part of the hope to bring some new names to light that maybe people might be less familiar with?
Yes. Again, there were certain things that made me want to write this book, and none were more important than that. I have a very close connection with the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City. My first book was about Buck O'Neil, the great Negro Leagues player and manager and spokesman.
Love Buck O'Neil so much.
Oh, well, you have to. He was the greatest. He was the absolute greatest. And he's going to the Hall of Fame now, which I'll be there in Cooperstown, celebrating and singing with everybody for that. It's the greatest. So the Negro Leagues have always been hugely important to me, and keeping Buck's memory alive is hugely important to me. So when I was writing this book, I knew there were going to be a number of Negro Leagues players in it. And then it was a question of, how many and where to put them. And like you say, it was also introducing people to some of the greatest players who ever lived, who they might literally have never heard of, like everybody, if you're a baseball fan of some, caring about history, about Satchel Paige and about Josh Gibson. I mean, those guys are really pretty famous, but you might not know Oscar Charleston, who I believe and many others believe was the greatest of all the Negro Leagues players. And you definitely don't know a guy named Bullet Rogan or Pop Lloyd or some of these other guys that are in this book. So yes, a very, very important part of this book for me was telling their story.
You talk about trying to find where do they fit, because we're talking about different eras. Yes. And normally I would say, how could you really do this? Because some of these people existed and ceased to exist before you were even born. So it's not like you could have ever seen them play or talk to them directly. But I have to imagine that writing that book on Houdini, you had to go down that same road a lot. So did you learn anything from the research side with the Houdini book that helped you put this list together?
Yes. Yeah, I would say definitely so. And I've always been interested in newspaper research, just as an example. Going back, one of my second book was called The Machine. It was about the 1975 Cincinnati Reds. And I went back and, back then we didn't have the easy access to old newspapers that we do now. So it was all microfilm, and I was in the library, and I get motion sickness. So I would be looking through microfilm for an hour, and then I would have to take a break and, whatever. But spent days and days and days, literally going day by day through that entire 1975 season. But when I went to write about Houdini, it really was this just fishing expedition of trying to find anything. And I lucked into some really cool stuff where even John would concede maybe I found some things that had not been particularly well known in the community. But it was just typing in the name Houdini and seeing where that led me, or chasing down a specific day that Houdini was supposed to be in Boston or in LA or wherever the case may be. And so that kind of research I had not done a lot of, and I did a lot of that with the Baseball 100. And I would start an essay and I would come upon something and I thought, okay, whoa, this is actually way more interesting than what I've been writing. And then I would go deep dive into, what newspapers were saying about that player that day. And then that might lead me to something else, which might lead me to something else. And it really was finding rabbit holes and just going to the bottom, or at least trying to get to the bottom of them. And that was a lot of fun. I mean, I really, really loved doing it. And I think that comes through. I think that the joy of exploration, I think hopefully comes through with this book, and going to be a big part of my next book. So, I mean, it's definitely, I learned so much about myself, about how to try to talk to people you don't know, and also research when I was writing the Houdini book.
I've heard some of your interviews since this book came out. I've heard you say that the person most people argue that shouldn't be on the list is Mike Mussina.
Yeah.
That one comes up. It's not even a contest.
Yes.
And I've heard you talk about how you wish you could have gotten Joey Votto on there. Yep. And I'm a huge Joey Votto fan as well. So
as am I. Yeah. And so and that is somebody who literally specifically yelled at me for not being on the list. Joey didn't yell at me. He just texted me with lots of exclamation points. But he's great. What a great player. And I wrote that book at the beginning before this past season, and he had a great season. So if I was doing the Baseball 100 today, he might be on the list.
Well, tell him to not slump.
I know
you got to keep that streak of never popping out to a first baseman alive. Once that happened.
What a player.
But I was curious, as you said, the biggest backlash was against Mike Mussina. Is there one name, not coming directly from the mouth of the forgotten, is there one name that tends to come up a lot of, hey, how did you not put that player in?
There are a few of those names. Shoeless Joe Jackson is not on this list, and there have been, I've heard from people. Eddie Murray was a great player, not on this list. Zach Greinke is, currently a great player and somebody I have written many, 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 many pieces about.
Mm-hmm. Ryan Sandberg.
Ryan Sandberg is a guy that's not on the list. Barry Larkin is a guy not on the list. There are a few guys that, well, I mean, I've said this in interviews, and it's 100% true. I had 40 players down for the last 10. Yeah. When I got down to the last 10, 91 through 100, I had 40 players on the list. And I mean, they weren't all equal, but they were
deserving,
pretty close. Yeah. I mean, they were pretty close. And so, it was Robbie Alomars, Ryan Sandberg, Barry Larkin. Like, I don't know. How do you choose between, those guys? So right. All great. Look, it's, I really did think about doing the Baseball 200, where I would write the next 100. But I don't believe my wife would be there for me when finished. So I decided to go on to something else.
Well, Max took the bait. I was really hoping he would bring up Ryan Sandberg to represent his Cubs. And I just have to represent my White Sox and say Minnie Minoso. Shout out to him.
Minnie was very close to making the list and going to the Hall of Fame. Couldn't be more excited.
Well, that's the segue right there. Hall of Fame. You are a Hall of Fame voter for 20 some years now, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, I actually got goosebumps saying that. I don't think I've ever spoken to a Hall of Fame voter before.
It's pretty awesome, man.
That's really cool.
It is a very cool thing. It is a very cool thing, except that people do yell at you.
Yeah.
but that's okay. That's okay.
So can you remember like the first time you got a ballot and what it was like getting that and being bestowed that honor and filling it out?
Look, it's very, very different than it is now, because now every player, it seems, is connected to something off the field that you've got to figure out, and so it was when I first got the ballot 20 years ago, it was like, all right, is that player good enough? Is this a good enough baseball player to get into the Hall of Fame? It seemed a lot more innocent in some ways. When you're not dealing with PEDs or whether a player, has offended half of the country or whatever the case may be. And so yeah, I mean, it was a bit surreal the first time. And the funny thing is, it's the thing that sounds the coolest, but the actual process is so voting for like your fifth grade class president or something. Like I'll give you an example. This past year, I don't say this to brag, but I will. This past year, I was given an award by the National Polish American Sports Hall of Fame. So I was inducted essentially as a media member.
Congratulations!
Yes, awesome. Thank you. So coming with that is you vote for the Hall of Fame going forward. So I just got my ballot the other day, and it's beautiful. It's like this beautiful cardboard ballot that opens up like a card, and it's just gorgeously designed. It's what I imagine voting for the Oscars is like or something. Like it's just this beautiful thing. The Baseball Hall of Fame ballot is a piece of paper with like the words printed on them. That's literally, and there's a box next to each name. And that's it. Honestly, it looks like something done on an old-fashioned mimeograph machine. I mean, it's this, and so there's this moment where you're like, oh my gosh, here it is, the envelope from the Baseball Hall of Fame, and then you open it up and you're like, wait, this is it? Like, I just literally write this on a piece of paper and just send it to them? Like that doesn't feel as cool as I thought it was going to feel. So, but obviously it's an incredible honor to vote, and I don't say it lightly that it has gotten harder and it's gotten less fun in some ways because there are so many issues now that you have to consider, or you're supposed to consider, or you might consider, you might not consider, that have very little to do with baseball. And I'm not a huge fan of that, but that's the world we live in.
Yeah. Geez. Out of curiosity, do you make your vote public? A lot of people do.
I do. I always do. Okay. I always write about it, and it's also public. So yeah. So I'm
who are you voting for?
I haven't written my piece yet. I haven't written my piece. But okay. Yeah. So I'll write it. The voting is over, but the ballot will not be revealed until January 25th. So sometime that week I'll write it and I'll send it to you guys. I'll send you the piece. So
cool. Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Sure. Just to stay in line and to honor one of your fellow inductees to the Polish American Sports Hall of Fame, AJ Posnanski.
Yes.
You should probably vote for Mark Burley.
Sure.
Just throwing that out there. Okay. So we at the Fantastic Story Society like to clear the floor and allow for a little bit of storytelling, which we've already had so much great storytelling here. I am curious, going back to your research for the life and afterlife of Harry Houdini. And by the way, if we haven't very clearly spelled this out yet, this is one, it's a great book. And two, it's something that I connect with so much because as a folklorist and historian, storyteller that I am, I love finding legends and then trying to get down to the bottom of where the truth is, which is what is happening in this book over and over and over again. Is there a story you can tell us about whether it's a surprising fact that you were surprised that it's not a fact, or maybe a fun adventure to finally getting down to the bottom of debunking a legend? Anything along those lines that come to mind?
Wow. There have been quite a few things where I heard about a story and tried to chase down the real story, and which is always surprising to me. Maybe it shouldn't be, I mean, we all know the famous, man who shot Liberty Valance line, right? If the legend is better than the truth, print the legend, right?
Yeah.
But it does surprise me how legends will just go down through history unquestioned. And at some point you get to it and you have to peel back layer after layer after layer after layer to get at what really happened, right? And what really is the truth. There was a great story about Stan Musial and during a game that Stan Musial was never thrown out of a game in his entire career. And there's a famous story about him hitting a ball that was called foul. That was, at the time, it was a home run that would have won the game, and it was called foul. And everybody on his team, all of his teammates, ran on the field and started screaming at the umpire, and they all got thrown out of the game. And then Stan Musial came over and said, "What's going on?" They said it was called foul, and he went, "Oh, okay." And he stepped up in the box and he hit a home run to exactly the same spot. and it's a beautiful story. And I read it in a dozen places. I mean, it just, but none of them ever gave enough details for me to figure it out. So, I mean, I was trying to chase that down for more than a year because it was a home run, and now we have so many more ways to chase down home runs. And I knew it was against the Cubs. So I was looking at all the home runs he hit against the Cubs, and none of them added up at all. And I was really I don't even remember what the breakthrough was, but I found the story. I didn't want to tell this one because, I mean, it's sort of an anticlimax. It did happen, not exactly that way. It was a double, and it wasn't a game-winning hit or anything like that. But it did happen that he hit a double that was bringing the Cardinals back. They called foul, and 3 guys got thrown out of the game, and then he went up and hit a double to the same spot. So lots of stuff like that. I don't know if that fulfills.
Well, what I love about that is it kind of defines the magic of baseball.
Yeah.
And combining Houdini and baseball obviously isn't always the easiest thing, but there's magic there. And
yes,
I think the magic comes from 2 things: the imagination of the viewer and the audience, but that I think stems from how slow the game is, and we have time to think about it.
Sure.
When we have, we're able to just sit there and watch these guys argue on the field. Like in football, they're like, "Nope, done, go away," and they don't have a fight and just get right back to center, and that's it. The football is just so much faster; you don't have time to think. But with baseball, you're waiting for that pitch to happen, and you're coming up with all the different possibilities. And sometimes you're like, "No, I like that possibility better. Yeah. I'm going to tell that story."
Yeah, I think that's right. I think also the action in baseball is so much more condensed than it is in football. I talk about this all the time because I'm doing a list now of the 100 greatest football players. Oh. And it's a very, very different challenge and a very different thing. In football, when you see a great play, you don't really know why it happened. Like you think right? The quarterback drops back, the receiver goes deep, you throw the receiver, touchdown, great play. So now you're like, okay, well, that's what but it might not be that at all. It really might be a running back who stepped in and blocked the blitz. It really might be a tight end who ran off the safety. Like it's so many things. But when you have a Stan Musial hitting a double, it's just Stan Musial, Right. So there's a condensed element of baseball that I think plays very well to storytelling.
Well, Joe, we want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us, to allow us to hear your story and your stories. Everybody, check out joeposnanski.com. That is JoePosnanski.com. And you can find the Baseball 100. Oh my gosh, all of his books all over the place too.
They're all there. They're all available. Yeah.
It's you just came out with a book that's nearly 900 pages long, and I can't wait for you to write more books. Which is really mean of me to say. You should just be able to bask in the glow for a while.
I should, but I actually have already signed to write my next book, and so it will be a baseball book, and it will be another countdown of sorts. Oh. And I'm very excited, and it will not be, if my publisher and agent have anything to do with it, it will not be 900 pages. They're going to stop me from doing that again.
That I was going to ask what the response was when they got the manuscript.
They were
once the forklifts were done.
Yeah, no, there was this like, well, we really running all of this? Like, are we really doing all of this? And I'm like, oh, yeah, I think so. So yeah,
you guys.
It's really crazy. I mean, and that's what's been so rewarding about it for me is, I wrote it exactly the way I wanted to write it. And it's 900, almost 900 pages. And it's been, kind of a phenomenon. So, I mean, it's been amazing. I'm unbelievably grateful for that.
Well, I have to ask now, and if you can't talk about this, we'll cut this question, even what I'm saying right now. Are you doing the book on fictional baseball heroes?
I am not exactly doing the book, although I love the concept. I have done some writing on fictional baseball heroes, but I will tell you that there might be some element of that in my next book.
All right. Sounds great. Thank you for teasing us and leading us on. And
yes.
I can't wait to talk to you next time about that.
Exactly right.
Obviously, it goes without saying, keep doing what you're doing, Joe. And we very grateful to have you on, and we'll be reading and listening to everything you have going on in the future. Good luck with the whole Hall of Fame voting, and I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you for listening. As you know, as we say all the time, there are fantastic stories everywhere. If you hear of any, let us know, and you might be our next guest.